Well, good morning, everyone. Uh, Thank you for checking in. I know there would be more people are coming shortly, but let me start with our introductions. The conference today is entitled, as you can see, Post-Pandemic Supply Chain Adjustments. And there are many. Agriculture certainly has been faced with some difficult adjustments. Interest rates have risen, and of course, to counter inflation, and some would argue that they've created inflation, certainly as food prices have gone up a lot. But there have also been external shocks. Certainly the invasion of Ukraine by Russia has affected us all. And of course, as people are trying to cope with the rise of interest rates and cost of living, we've seen more strikes and labor activity to try and catch up. Added to these macroeconomic effects, we'll need to address some other changes. Certainly, transport costs have been rising because of carbon taxes. And of course, we have unusual weather problems that are with us all the time. So the environment is also a big factor in terms of what's been happening in this post-adjustment or post-pandemic adjustment. This morning, the discussion ranges from food prices and inflation to the longer-term impacts of climate change. Subsequently, we're going to turn our attention to the alternative fuels and the use of food products such as canola oil in terms of combating some of the emissions that are coming from our transport systems. At lunchtime, we'll get a farmer's view of the climate change policy. And then in the afternoon, we're going to turn to some modal issues. We'll be looking at agricultural trucking and also a new marketplace invention to ease and reduce the cost of transactions. Finally, the last section will turn to the Eastern Grain Corridor, and we'll have a wonderful panel to look at the Great Lakes and Seaway shipping system, including the port, the carrier, and of course, the Seaway manager. So an exciting day ahead of us. But before I invite Dean Silvestre to bring greetings on behalf of the University of Manitoba, I'd like to thank the sponsors of the 28th Annual Fields on Wheels, CN Rail and the Port of Thunder Bay, the Port of Vancouver, the CPKC Railway, and Seaway Highway H2O. So at this point, if Dr. Silvestre is available, I'd like to ask him to come on and give us some welcome from the university.
Thank you so much, Barry. Thank you for the introduction, and good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 28th Fields on Wheels conference. This is a dream that emerged 28 years ago, and has been phenomenal in terms of contributing to transportation discussion, agriculture, logistics, and supply chain. And as the Dean of the Asper School of Business, I'm thrilled to welcome you to join this conference organized by the University of Manitoba Transport Institute and enriched by the collaboration of the Asper School of Business and the Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences. We are pleased to welcome experts from across disciplines today in industries and the academy to lead engaging discussions related to post-pandemic supply chain adjustments that we all know are not simple, very complex matters to deal with. The pandemic specifically highlighted the need for more resilient supply chains for food, as efficient supply chains are integral part to keeping food affordable and accessible. Even as we adjust to adapt our supply chains post-pandemic, climate change continues to create challenges for maintaining affordable food prices. Cross-disciplinary exchanges of knowledge like this one allows us to tackle these pressing concerns, these multidisciplinary concerns, by engaging our shared expertise and affirming our commitment to devising truly sustainable solutions. The Asper School of Business and the University of Manitoba are proud to champion sustainability-focused research and teaching to ensure that future leaders enter their field, prioritizing environmental stewardship, sustainable development, and innovation. Thank you for joining us today, and please enjoy this fantastic programming that the Transport Institute and Barry's team put together today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dean Silvestre, and I appreciate you being available with us this morning. I'm going to be chairing the first session, and the way we're going to operate the session is we have each speaker has roughly 20 minutes for their presentation, and then we'll have some questions in each case. In order to operate the questions, we have only a chat on this system of Zoom. So if you could direct your questions to the chair, I'll be the first chair, so direct them to me. And then subsequently in the next session, direct them to Hedley Ald, who will be chairing that session, and so on. Without further ado, let's get started. Our first speaker, which I'm pleased to introduce, is Michael van Massow. He's a professor in the Department of Food, Agriculture, and Resource Economics at the University of Guelph. Mike is interested in how people think about food and recent work focusing on labeling, alternative proteins, novel food products, animal welfare, and antibiotic use. A very wide range of interests, Mike. Mike's interest also considers the structure and performance of food value chains, including farm practices, as they evolve in response to changing consumer preferences and other factors. He has written for the Globe and Mail and other publications, and is often quoted on radio and the media. You may have heard him earlier last week on CJOB, speaking about his talk. He is a frequent blogger and a strong presence on broadcast, print, and social media. Mike is committed to sharing research and perspective in a manner that helps to inform public policy and private strategy. Mike has also introduced his food-focused podcast, so you might want to try and find that, to discuss issues of interest in the food space. And his presentation today is The Drivers of Food Inflation and Implications for Supply Chain Resilience. Thank you very much for being with us, Mike, and over to you.
Well, thanks for having me, Barry. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm a Manitoba native, although I live in Ontario now, and a U of M alumnus. So it's exciting to be at least virtually with you today. So let me just share my screen here. So Barry invited me to talk a little bit about the drivers of food inflation and the implications for supply chain resilience. And to a degree, you know, Barry has covered some of the high level things already just in his introduction. So I'm going to go into it in a little bit more detail. I'm also going to talk. To me, there are multiple drivers here, and what we see sort of in the common policy discourse is trying to find that silver bullet that will address food price inflation, and we can't find it is the reality. So let's talk a little bit first about what we're seeing relative to food price inflation, and the numbers actually now look a little better than they did a few months ago, but we've had sort of generational and sustained levels of food price inflation that we haven't seen for a long time, and currently we're seeing 5.4% year over year. I would argue that inflation is very poorly understood, and food inflation is very poorly understood, at least when it comes to the media that I speak to. You know, people will say, "Oh, food prices were up 5.4% last month," when the Stats Canada numbers come out. And the truth is that that's a year over year change. And the reality is that in 4 out of the last 5 months, we've actually seen grocery prices go down. They just haven't gone down to levels below what they were a year ago. So I think it's important to remember that context, to remember and understand that not everything is going up universally. There isn't just sort of this crank on prices that everything's going up simultaneously, and that those numbers reflect what's happening in a month. There's considerable variation, and I think that helps us understand sort of the fact that different things are going up differently. And in fact, if you look at pork is up less than the 5.4%. And if you're in the pork business, you'll understand why that is, given some of the struggles we're having in that sector. And ham and bacon are actually down 7.5%. So that 5.4% is an average. There are some things that are up much more than that. There are some things that are actually down. And I think that's in some important context as we talk about some of the drivers of inflation. I think it's also worth talking a little bit about the fact that consumers are looking for someone to blame. And I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes a bit later about the sort of the grocery industry and those sorts of things. So it's not just consumers, but governments and others are looking for someone or something to blame for food inflation, so that we can make it better magically. And I would argue that that there isn't a silver bullet. That most of these issues are beyond the control of most of governments, of grocers, and of others to make a difference. So what is contributing to inflation? We heard Barry talk earlier about the war in Ukraine. The war in Ukraine has had a substantial impact. If we look at wheat and oil seeds, the impact on trade flows, we've taken that largely sunflower oil and wheat that we've seen coming from Ukraine in the past come out of the market. And that affects the world price. We are price takers, and we've seen flour, pasta, bakery products go up substantially. Vegetable oils go up substantially. It hasn't affected availability in this country. In some of the countries, particularly in the Middle East, that were direct customers of Ukraine, we actually saw food shortages in the short run. As we know, supply chains take some time to adapt when product flows change. And frankly, while we've seen some adaptation and we've seen some adjustment in commodity prices, this impact is likely here for a while. And it's been exacerbated by policy in other countries. We know India then said, we're going to try and protect our urban poor, and we're going to control export of wheat. Argentina did the same thing. We know Malaysia put controls on export of palm oil, which is a substitute for sunflower oil. So it wasn't just the war in Ukraine, it was some of these other policies that exacerbated. Those of you in the session here today will know directly about oil and fertilizer, and that's driven costs in the food system. The freight costs are quite easily passed on, or quite directly passed on to consumers, notwithstanding some market power from the grocers. But fertilizer costs have driven costs for farmers, but because we're often price takers in some of these commodities, it means margins have been squeezed, and that isn't sort of always directly passed on to consumers. So what else? Well, there's extreme weather. Simply, we see extreme weather disrupting supply chains. We can look back a couple of years to the flooding in British Columbia, but we're also seeing it more directly impacting production of food, which reduces supply and drives costs up. So we saw flooding and viruses in California. I know the next speaker is going to talk about produce. That's something that we've seen. We know it's been dry in parts of Western Canada. We're seeing some liquidation in cattle herds, which will probably drive some price increases into the future. India banned export of non-basmati rice recently, again in response to weather pressure on rice supplies. So it's happening everywhere, and it's happening with greater frequency. When I talk about inflation and food prices, and I get asked to look into my crystal ball for the future, I say really the only thing that we know for sure is that we don't know. The only thing that's predictable is unpredictability, and we're really to a large degree at the mercy of this weather. This isn't new. I think that we're just seeing it more frequently and more extreme. I think back, 7 or 8 years ago when we were talking about $10 cauliflower in the winter due to a weather event in California. It's just that we have this sort of aggregation of impacts, not only of weather, but of the war and of other things that are disrupting and causing sort of this cascading increase in food prices. The Canadian dollar has been lower, particularly in the last year. That matters at this time of year when we're importing and paying for things in American dollars, and so it's interesting. I've had people say, well, interest rates are going up, but that means food prices are going up, and the truth is that interest rates are intended to go up to try and moderate inflation generally, and I'll say in a few minutes that that's less likely to impact food for a variety of reasons. But the Canadian dollar is probably lower in the last year because we haven't increased interest rates at the same rate as we saw happen in the U.S., which affected the Canadian dollar. There have been other factors too, and I could go on. Could go on and on about different factors that play a role, and I'll talk, as Barry said, in a minute about carbon tax. One of the things we're hearing a lot about, it's been in the news a lot, is grocers, and I would argue that this is governments and other pundits looking for a scapegoat. While I am not a particular I am not going to say that the grocers are good corporate citizens. I would argue that they are not necessarily contributing significantly to food price inflation. The graph that you'll see here is a graph of income as a percentage of total revenue over the last 5 or 6 years for the 3 main Canadian grocers and 2 significant grocers in the US. And it's imperfect. I will acknowledge it's imperfect, but we can look at what's changed because if they're driving inflation, you would expect these percentages to change. And I think the first point to make is when Galen Weston testified to Parliament that, if we made zero money, inflation still would have been positive in the last few years, positive and significant. So I think that is a point to be made. If you look, the blue line there is the blue line in this histogram is Loblaws, and we can see that it's been up and down. 2017 it was 5.3. 2018 it was 2.1. 2020, before we saw this inflation, it was 4.5. Then we saw 5.5 and 5.9 in the last. This is taken from their own annual reports. Now that looks like we've seen sort of a 1% jump for Loblaws, and I would argue that that's largely because of pressure back on their suppliers, and we heard Galen Weston say that we haven't accepted so their increase in profit percentage is largely at the expense of their suppliers, which is not a good thing, which is a demonstration of market power, but doesn't necessarily reflect in higher grocery prices, particularly if you look at the orange line there, which has been Sobeys, which is the second largest player in Canada. Sobeys has been, 4.2, 4.6, 4.5. So no indication that they're making a larger percentage over costs so that they are driving food prices beyond what their price increases. And it's hard to believe that Loblaws would be able to extract more from the consumer side of the market, given the position of Sobeys there. The gray line is the big one. The tall one is actually Metro, which is the third largest grocer in Canada. I would argue that their difference is driven largely by their pharmacy business rather than by their grocery business. And some of these differences, even between Loblaws and Sobeys, will be driven by what markets they're in, which sort of brands are doing well within their portfolios. and also the fact that Loblaws has a significant separate pharmacy business, Shoppers Drug Mart. You know, in the annual report, they brag about administering millions of doses of vaccine and doing millions of tests, which clearly would generate revenue as well. So while these percentages are a little higher in Canada, which may suggest that there's some room for improved competition, it doesn't look like grocers have driven food price inflation. So should we be doing something? We're hearing a lot about grocery code of conduct. I would argue that a grocery code of conduct would be a good thing to do. It would set parameters around the relationship between grocers and their suppliers, but it wouldn't do a lot for food prices. And if anything, I'm going to agree again with Galen Weston. It'll be inflationary. I don't think it would be significantly inflationary. Probably not as much as he argues. You know, I think what he's saying is this is how much money would come out of our to a degree out of our bottom line, but their ability to pass that on, which they would be tempted to, will be limited because other companies have said we deal with our suppliers differently. There's a question of more competition. More competition is always good, but we have to think about sort of economies of scale, economies of size, and even in the Competition Bureau's report, we heard them say that some of those European discounters have said that they aren't keen to come to Canada because they think they'll compete. So again, I'm not sure that will do a bunch for prices. We heard Barry talk a little bit about the carbon tax. I think it's having an impact, but it's relatively modest on food prices. So people like you in the logistics businesses are feeling it significantly, but it's relatively modest. 0.1 to 0.2% of food price inflation. Now we have to acknowledge that that's going to go up as the carbon tax goes up. But in the context of sort of this generational food price inflation, it's been relatively modest. I think the other thing to remember is that the majority of Canadian households are actually getting more money back from the carbon tax than they're paying in. So it's worth looking at whether that net increase is covering sort of the cost increases they're seeing. There are agricultural carve-outs. There's a significant debate now about what's happening in the Senate relative primarily to grain drying, to a degree to barn heating for those that use natural gas. But again, it's there. It matters, and it matters more for individual businesses who are carbon intensive, but it's not making a whole lot of difference, I would argue, in food prices. The other big one we hear is government spending and debt. It is important, but it's less so for food. And if you look at where interest rates have gone, and we're all feeling the impact of those interest rates, those are really intended to go onto the demand side, affect the ability to lend, affect cash flow in the ability to borrow, affect cash flow in households. And so we can defer the price, the purchase of a new car, of a new computer, of a new phone, of hard goods. We can defer a vacation, all of those sorts of things. We can't defer food purchases. And so interest rate policy and demand type policies don't really have a whole lot of impact on food prices. So I think that's worth taking a look at. Not to say we shouldn't be having that discussion, but it's just not that important in the context of food prices. So what can we do? Well, I think in terms of supply chains, resilience matters, but I think what we need to think about as we move forward here is resilient to what and for whom. And let me explain a little bit what I mean there with my little time that I have left. If we look at I study supply chain resilience. If I look at what other people have said, it's the ability of the supply chain to return to normal quickly and adapt. But we have to think about, we have a significant recency bias. If we look at what happened during supply chain disruptions, during lockdowns, due to COVID, everyone said we should localize supply chains due to these disruptions, shorten our supply chains. But we need to think about, if we take diversity out of the system, sort of diverse suppliers out of the system, we become more susceptible to climate change. So we have to look at what the relative risks are, what are the costs of those risks, and then balance our response, because increasing localization might help protect us from supply chain disruptions, but it may make us more susceptible, frankly, to climate change risk and production disruptions. I think the question of resilience for whom is interesting. If we look at what happened, for example, when beef packing plants closed down during COVID, we saw McDonald's have to say, well, we can't guarantee Canadian beef for a while. But really, we saw a very modest bump in beef prices as a result of that, and really, almost in no cases did we see sustained shortages of product. The supply chain adapted. We have an integrated protein supply chain. We could get product from other countries, and so really, the supply chain looked very resilient to those closures, except for beef producers who had a product that was continuing to cost them and was reducing in value. And so if you ask a beef producer, it wasn't that resilient. If you ask a consumer, it was resilient. And I think we need to really think about how we evaluate that in terms of stakeholders. And then there's this discussion about increasing capacity. Maybe we should have more packing plants. Well, we all know that the Canadian packing plants are smaller than the US ones already. And we've seen plants come up in Canada and disappear. So we have to, again, balance resilience with cost. What is the actual risk, and how can we adapt to it? So I think I'm getting to the end of my time, Barry. I hope I didn't go over. I'm going to close here with some shameless self-promotion. I think we'll have a few minutes to answer some questions, but if you have questions, that's my email. That's me on the declining platform once known as Twitter. And as Barry outlined, foodfocusguelph.ca, you can see my blog and podcast, lots of discussions about food issues. So thank you for the time, and looking forward to some questions.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, and welcome back to Manitoba, at least virtually.
Yeah.
There are some questions starting to come in, but I do have one for you. We've observed grain prices have declined quite a bit from where they peaked, and certainly the trucking costs have been going down for the last 8 months directly. So and oil prices are going down. But does food price have a ratchet effect? In other words, it goes up and it never comes back down. They just level off, and they'll absorb their costs for a while and move up again, or do you think we'll see food prices coming back down?
Well, I think again, I would argue that we've seen in 4 of the last 5 months, we've actually seen modest price decreases. It's just that we're still high relative to a year ago. So I think we are seeing some of that relief already. The other thing is that there's usually a delay in reflecting food price decreases to commodity and other decreases. Some stuff is pre-booked, and so it takes a while for that inventory to come through the system. And frankly, food prices are often stickier downwards. And so I think that not only is there the delay as inventory moves through the system, but if people were squeezed on the way up, then they try and build those margins back up as they come down. And what's interesting is, Barry, I've argued since the beginning, all of this discussion of evil grocers. If grocers are going to profit from food price inflation, I would argue they'll profit more as prices come down and they adapt more slowly than they did when prices go up. So I think there is room for optimism, Barry, but there are a number of reasons that those delays, that it might not come as quickly as we'd like to see.
Yeah, and certainly some of the things that we do see, you mentioned the US Canada exchange rate. Most people I've seen suggest that the US dollar is overvalued by maybe 10%. And
Yep.
so as the US dollar, Canadian dollar exchange rate comes more in line, which means I think maybe an 80-cent Canadian dollar, that would help our food prices as well.
It would help, particularly in the winter when our exports are at their highest. I think if you look at what we often forget is we also see seasonal variation in food prices. So we expect some variability in food prices throughout the year. Food prices are higher in the winter than they are in the summer. Well, not for everything. There are some, beef, for example, is often a little more expensive in the summer as demand goes up. But generally, our food prices are higher in the winter and come down in the summer. And so those peaks in the winter will be moderated if the Canadian dollar improves relative to the US dollar.
A lot of moving pieces. This one may take you out of your comfort zone, but the question comes up about, in the financial world, Bitcoin has come along and has some investment going into Bitcoin affected the dollar. Is that anything that's those, I guess, turbulence within these markets matter?
Well, I think uncertainty matters, and what we're seeing is greater potential for volatility. I'm not a Bitcoin expert. I think maybe it's having less of a role in exchange rates than it did a year or two or more ago, as when it was sort of at the cusp of, or at the peak of its influence. But I think that there is real there are a number of things that mean we're going to see more variability, and I would expect more variability in food prices going forward.
Yeah, another questions come in more or less regarding the idea of the carbon tax, and that the Bank of Canada has said it doesn't really have any particular effect, I suppose. And we do see it finding its way through everything. Is that a fair statement? I mean, you mentioned that you didn't think it was very effective either. Is that just the level of the carbon tax, or is it how it's being, compensated for that matters?
Well, I mean, I saw that comment in chat the comment in chat that there are people who say that it's having a bigger impact. It's not just the Bank of Canada. There are a number of organizations. Trevor Toome at the University of Calgary has published a couple of papers saying that for food price, not to say that the carbon tax isn't hurting some businesses, but that the impact on food prices is relatively modest, and I would tend to agree with that. Now, 0.2% in the context of historical inflation rates is not insignificant, and I think if we look at where the carbon tax is going to go, we will see more impacts on food prices going forward. I just don't think it's been that big an impact looking backwards.
Very good. Well, Mike, I don't. Oh, here's another one just came in. Maybe you can read it in chat yourself. A regulation of the railways. I think this is really talking about the regulation, and does regulation have a role in all of the food price raises?
Sorry, let me just read it. Great.
I may not be doing justice to the question.
It's interesting to look at the impact of regulation. I see the previous question also asked about supply management. So policy will have an impact without a doubt, and we have to balance I suppose. It's, you know, I think it's not my place to say which regulations we should have and which we shouldn't. But we need to balance the objectives of regulation. Again, you can go back to the carbon tax. The objective of the carbon tax is to change behavior, not necessarily to raise revenues. It's to change behavior. Now, it's more difficult for farmers to change behavior without alternatives. And I would argue that if we're going to get, like we did for heating oil in Atlantic Canada, if we're going to do carve outs, maybe we say this is going to happen for 10 years and eventually you're going to have to pay, which would allow people to adapt, or find alternatives. But if people can't change their behavior, then it just becomes a revenue source and frankly will then contribute more to costs. So yes, regulation will increase costs and so increase prices. We have to balance that with what the objectives of that regulation is.
As you say, that things will change behavior, certainly prices change behavior. And the question is, are people buying cheaper cuts and, you know, economizing that way?
Yeah, so we see consumers responding to higher prices in a number of ways. We see, we see at the margin. So we've seen an increase in food insecurity. So people at the bottom end of the income scale are just buying fewer calories and having to go elsewhere. But we see a significant impact of trading, what I call trading down, buying cheaper cuts. Maybe doing one meal a week without an animal protein. And so we see changes in behavior. We've also seen people shopping differently. We know that there is a difference between different types of stores in prices. And even the big grocery chains are saying our discount stores are seeing a significantly higher volume of business, which may actually help drive their profits because while prices may be cheaper, I think margins may be a little higher in those lower price stores because they need turns, they need return per shelf space. So yeah, there are lots of things that people are doing differently. One of the things that I'd argue that we should be doing differently, but aren't to a significant degree, is changing some of our purchasing habits. We as Canadians are very much creatures of habit. If broccoli was in your basket last week, it's likely to be in your basket this week. You know, everyone sort of, oh, that night is fish night or that night is burger night. And the ability to adapt to seasonal produce or to more storable Canadian things. I like to tell the story. I'm a first generation Canadian, grew up with European parents who ate stuff that was familiar from home. And my wife and I just the other day bought a great big red cabbage for $6 and ate 3 meals from it. And so there are ways, but not everyone can do that. And not everyone knows how to prepare it. Not everyone is open to it. But if we adapt our purchases, which some people are doing, we're seeing that there is, that people are able to sort of buffer themselves at least a little bit.
Mike, thank you so much. I think at this point I should reserve more questions until the end, so please don't go away. But let me introduce our next speaker, and perhaps this will raise some questions for you as well. So our next speaker, which I'm very pleased to introduce, is Pamela Kolochuk, CEO of Peak of the Market. Pamela Kolochuk was named CEO of Peak of the Market in July of 2021. She has a CPA, MBA, and is a certified change leader with over 15 years of experience in senior financial leadership. Pamela is renowned for her innovative growth strategies and for creating engaged and productive employee teams. Pamela was also born and raised on a dairy farm south of St. Cloud, Manitoba, and has been part of agriculture since that time, first working for large Canadian grain companies and now with Peak of the Market. Her talk is From Seed to Plate, Navigating the Produce Supply Chain. And Pamela, over to you.
Thank you, Barry. So good morning. I'm Pamela Kolochuk, the CEO of Peak of the Market. Thank you very much for the last presentation. It kind of led right into talking about produce and seed to plate and what's going on in the supply chain in produce in Manitoba and North America. So as Barry said, I was born in Manitoba into the ag industry, and I've been working in the ag space since I graduated from Asper. So Peak of the Market, some of you may know about Peak of the Market, some of you may not know. So Peak of the Market is, we grow, pack, and distribute fresh, high quality produce across North America. Most of the produce that we distribute across North America is grown right here in Manitoba. We are driven by a dedicated group of growers and staff, and we fill produce aisles with everything from asparagus to zucchini. So while we're known for potatoes, we also grow many other things in Manitoba. And we've been around for more than 80 years, so we've earned a reputation of ensuring the produce grown exceeds the national standard for safety and quality, and that customers receive superior service. So I have a little video to show you in regards to how Peak supply chain works from seed to plate. So I hope this works with the sound.
Peak of the Market is rooted in excellence and defined by 80 years of producing quality vegetables for our community. It's the passion and commitment by both growers and staff that make Peak of the Market the brand consumers search for in their local store. Growers are our foundation. Their compassion for growing with care, cultivating only the best, and preserving the land for the future is what sets them apart. It's the passion for their work that shines in the quality that is harvested. That same devotion is shown by everyone trusted with the care and handling of Peak of the Market products. Through a collaborative and open approach, diversity and inclusion are encouraged, and all ideas are patiently considered. Innovation, research, and a collective commitment to excellence are the ingredients that have served our community so well for over 8 decades. At every step along the way, all of us at Peak of the Market pride ourselves in the business at hand, growing the best products in the most sustainable ways to feed fellow Canadians for many years to come.
So while many of you may drive by 1200 King Edward and wonder what's going on behind these walls, we're owned by 11 growers. We pack product here in Winnipeg, and we distribute product across North America from our facility in Winnipeg here, and we have one in Calgary as well. Our 11 growers are all based in Manitoba, mostly in the South Winkler area to the border, as well as we have a few growers that are around Portage la Prairie, where we grow things like carrots and cauliflower and those types of things. So while most people think that only potatoes are really grown here and maybe carrots and onions, we grow many varieties of reds, yellows, russets, whites, and fingerling potatoes, along with creamer potatoes, which many of you see in the little potato company bag, as well as onions, carrots, and then all of these items are grown right here in Manitoba. So from a supply chain perspective, with weather and things that are going on, being in a province where we have winter almost 8 months of the year, Mother Nature plays a huge impact on our ability to supply fresh produce to North America and specifically Manitobans. We grow the most fresh acres of potatoes in Canada, right here in southern Manitoba. So when we talk about fresh potatoes, it's potatoes that you buy in your grocery store that you would cook and eat at your table. We work closely with our group of growers to make sure that we have, and our customers, to make sure that we have the right product grown and we have the availability for a 12-month supply program. So in Manitoba, we grow enough potatoes to supply 80% of the Western market with potatoes all year round, and we export 40% of what we grow. So just to give you a bit of an insight on how potatoes are grown in Manitoba before they get to your grocery shelf, here's a little video at Southern Potato Farms.
I'm Marlon Cool. I'm a potato farmer with Southern Potato Company, and we grow potatoes for Peak of the Market. You know a potato plant is happy when it looks like these. These plants are nice and green, the rows are filled out. We're just looking for a nice, lush, healthy canopy and good health underneath, meaning good root systems and nice looking little potatoes. The potato growing season starts well before the season. We're looking at planting already now for next year. Ideally, spring planting would be in late April or May, followed by hilling shortly after and constant monitoring and crop scouting throughout the season until harvest, which is about September. Our potato farm is sustainable and we'll continue to focus on that. We implement different practices such as cover cropping and looking at soil health and whatever we can do to improve that. We're also looking at the latest innovative research and ideas and test them. We're always looking for ways to improve. Soil organic matter is how much material is in your soil, and it can be measured through a soil test. It's important to maintain that for soil health, as organic matter helps move nutrients within your soil and certainly is a measure of how healthy your soil is. I love growing potatoes because it combines a bunch of my passions, which include farming and working outside, working with great people, and working in a great industry.
So as you can see, growers are essentially the base and priority of our supply chain. Growers ensure that we have product to sell, and what they do to ensure that we have good quality product as well as sustainable product is making sure that they have land that can continue to grow for years to come. In Manitoba and across Canada and even North America, growers are decreasing, they're not increasing, and as they consolidate, the acres are not necessarily increasing. So we need to make sure, as Peak, we're making sure that farmers are successful in what they're doing and helping them distribute and sell their product and ensuring it's getting to, consumers. So we distribute and pack grower product as well as work with retailers and food service across North America in order to ensure that it gets to the consumer's plate. So the supply chain process at Peak involves sales, sourcing and procurement, transportation, inventory management, and order fulfillment. So to give you a bit of an idea, this is a flow chart of our supply chain process. This is a simple supply chain process, product moving flow chart for Peak. Most of our product comes from farm. So about, 80% of our product is grown right here in Manitoba. And then we import 20% of our product from across Canada and the US and Mexico in order to ensure that we have product that can be on produce shelves 12 months of the year. So we want to make sure that freshness is key. And as you can see, we use a lot of truck transportation. No produce moves by rail. And it moves quite a bit depending on which retailer we're dealing with and whether or not they move product out of province in order to get to their DC, or if they're moving product direct to the store here in Manitoba or in Alberta. So we have distribution and packing centers, as mentioned, in Winnipeg and Calgary in order to optimize order fulfillment. And our reach right now, as you can see, is in every blue state and province across North America. So our reach includes in the US over 30 states. And by being located where we are centrally within Canada, even though Calgary is a little bit to the west on the other side, it ensures that we're reducing our sustainable footprint in regards to the fuel that's being used and the amount of product that we're moving around. We partner with growers across Alberta as well as Saskatchewan and BC in order to help move their product into grocers and food service across Canada and the west side of the United States. So with distributing produce, it comes with a number of unique challenges. Since COVID, workforce has been a huge challenge in produce. The workforce is much more transient than it has been in the past. People are looking for a 4-day-a-week job. They're not looking for full-time hours necessarily. They want to work from home. And when you work in produce, you're distributing produce, you need to be in the distribution center. You need to be committed to what we're doing. We are open 24 hours a day, 364 days of the year in order to ensure that our consumers have access to product on the shelves. we want to make sure that whenever a consumer goes into that grocery store, that they have the ability to buy the product that they want and that they're never having to ask for it from the produce manager. The other thing has a huge impact on peak and our growers is Mother Nature and climate change. It's having a huge impact on the produce industry as a whole, as we see drought happening in southern US as well as California, which impacts other products other than potatoes, as well as the drought that's happening in Alberta, and then the impacts to soil that's happening in PEI and Ontario and Quebec. Our growers spend a lot of time ensuring that their soils are of perfect condition to grow crops. We rotate our produce grown in our fields once every 3 years. So we only grow produce once of the 3 years in order to ensure that that land has the ability to rebuild its nitrogen and growing conditions. We also want to make sure that it's can last forever, right? So if we don't continue to be able to grow product in Manitoba and end up in a situation that's happening in California where we're starting to have food deserts, it's not going to be good for Canadians or North Americans if we can't continue to grow food in Canada. So climate change and addressing climate change and sustainability is something that is very close to everything that we do at Peak and everything that the growers do. Another challenge that we have is regulatory compliance. So it was mentioned in the last, I think it was a question in the last presentation in regards to regulations and impacting price. Depending on what the regulation is, it definitely impacts price. We have regulations that come down from government in regards to food safety and new rules that are coming all the time in regards to Canadian Food Act and the Food Safety Act, what's happening between Canada and the US, and how the regulatory compliance in Canada and the rules associated here are different than what the rules are in US. It's actually easier for us to export product to the US and sell to the US than it is to sell in some places in Canada. So it makes the US more enticing for us to sell there instead of keeping the product here in Manitoba, which isn't great. You would hope that the Canadian government wants to keep Canadian food in Canada, but we don't always feel that that's the case, especially with some of the rules that are coming out in regards to the grocery conduct, and other things in regards to PMRA and pesticides that are being used here, are not being able to be used here, and they are in the United States. The other thing is seasonal variations in supply and demand. So this has a big impact on climate change as well. So, depending on the growing season, how well the growing season was, this really has an impact on prices in the grocery store as well as ability to supply product 12 months of the year. That's why sometimes you see asparagus all year round, sometimes you don't. Same as things like radishes and celery. It's really dependent on the ability to supply based on the demand that's coming out. And another thing that's cropped up, I would say, in the last couple of years is retail standards and expectations. So while government is trying to make rules in regards to climate change, carbon tax, grocery conduct, code of conduct, retailers are also coming out with their own standards and expectations. So Walmart has a standard that they've come out as of 2025. Anyone who sells to Walmart has to be using fully recyclable and compostable product. That means all packaging used on all produce has to be fully recyclable and compostable. The other thing that's coming out is reducing your footprint from a fuel standpoint, from a impact on soil standpoint. So we do reporting on all of these things in regards to like how much nitrogen we put in the soil, cover crop, the energy we use in our building, how much energy we use this year versus last year. Are we recycling paper in the building? Are recycling cans? We have to report on all of those things in order to be compliant with Walmart. We have to hit a specific standard that reduces our carbon footprint. So we've been able to meet that and have completed that for 2025. But that's just one store or one retailer that's coming out and doing this. Now Loblaws has come out and has created their own standards that are similar to Walmart, but in some cases different, that we have to meet and report on. And all of those takes time and energy on behalf of Peak or anyone else that's selling produce or farms in reporting back to these retailers. So as mentioned, as a player, within the produce supply chain, it's important that we're as sustainable as possible by still remaining profitable. So, our commitment to sustainability means having a positive impact on people, the environment, and our community. And at Peak, we not only have our own internal sustainability goals, but we have to meet our goals of our customers, as mentioned. Now, changing all of your packaging to be recyclable and fully compostable is not inexpensive. And the retailers are not taking on those costs. The produce suppliers are taking on those costs. It's very hard to pass on costs of requirements of retailers back to the retailer, which is one of the reasons why the Grocery Code of Conduct was started, was because of the fact that the grocers are asking us to do all of these things, but we're not getting any reimbursement or recognition in return. In regards to, reducing food waste. So sorry, going back to packaging. So at Peak, all of our packaging is fully recyclable and are compostable. You'll notice that in the grocery store now, we used to have, we now have all brown packaging if it's in a paper bag. In the past, Peak used to have bright purple or brown or blue bags, and anything that has high ink concentration is not recyclable. So we've transitioned all of our packaging to be brown with black writing in order to ensure that it's recyclable and compostable. In regards to reducing food waste, is something that we have to report on as well to our retailers. We do not put any food in the garbage at Peak. Our preference is to feed people first. And if we can't do that with our products, then we're feeding animals. So we work with organizations across Canada in order to supply food that is not necessarily retail standard. And when it is not edible, we provide it to farmers that are surrounding Winnipeg and close to Peak here. The other thing we do is we do a lot of research and innovation. So we have a research site in Winkler, and that's where we explore potato varieties, impacts on climate, impacts on, resistance to climate changes, resistance to drought, improving agronomics, improving yields, because as we have less land to grow on, we need to be able to grow more food. So we're also a member of the Potato Sustainability Alliance that is in association across North America. It's a collaboration of key players in the potato value chain where we're defining, measuring, and advancing potato sustainability. The potato industry is a huge industry across North America. So we have, players like McCain's, Simplot, Peak, Little Potato Company, and others that are part of the PSA. And we focus on nitrogen use efficiency, irrigation use efficiency, greenhouse gas emissions, pesticide risk, worker safety, and waste and recycling. So where do we see the future going in produce? A lot more automation and robotics in order to support our supply chain. If you visited Peak before, or you want to come and visit Peak, you can always reach out to us. We have robots and a lot of automation here at Peak in order to be able to reduce our workforce. So nobody is lifting packaging as product is packed, so palletizes and packs the product. As we continue to move into the future, we're seeing more and more automation in regards to that. When you go to our farms have state-of-the-art automation in regards to washing and grading product and storing product. The other thing that we're looking at in produce is the analytics and artificial intelligence. So as we look to AI, how can AI support us in creating a better product to grow, whether it's in Manitoba or Alberta, that's more sustainable to our ground, but also has more yield and is more drought resistant as we continue to move forward. It can help create, help with breeding new varieties of potatoes and new varieties of vegetables in order to meet the changes that are happening within climate. And there's going to be a continued focus on sustainability initiatives. I mean, sustainability is the hot topic anywhere you go these days, whether it's government, farm, or retailer. And it's going to continue to be pushed to ensure that we are, having the least impact on the environment as possible, so that way we can continue to grow food for the rest of, the Earth's life at the end of the day. We need to make sure that we are able to continue to grow food here in Manitoba and in Canada, and we are hoping to continue to be leaders in that area in produce. So that's a little bit about, Peak and the supply chain. It's just a glimpse into what we do, but I'd love to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Pam. That was actually really interesting to explore all the various aspects of the produce in Manitoba. Certainly, one of the things that has struck me over time is the growth in the variety of number of potatoes. You showed 5, and I'm a potato lover. So when I came west, I was impressed by the quality of Manitoba potatoes. I think they're much better than what we find in the East. Now, that may be now a Western bias I have, but in any case, I'd love to see these new varieties of potatoes. Has that diversity, how has that benefited the growers and Peak of the market?
So while, there's reds, white, yellows, russets, creamers, and fingerlings, there's hundreds of varieties of potatoes that we grow. So when a consumer goes and looks at it in the grocery store, it's a red potato to them. But it's not a red potato to many of the people that work here, because the variety of that potato is dependent on, look, skin, storage ability. So when we're looking at, and I would agree, I may be biased, but it's the truth. Manitoba potatoes are seen as a premium potato across North America, which I think is what makes us successful as Peak. And, it's our claim to fame here. It's really the rich soil that's grown in that's in the Winkler area, that black sandy soil that supports the growing of it. But it's also the varieties that we grow. Tracy spent a lot of time looking at varieties and working on varieties that will stay dormant and in storage for 12 months of the year, right? So while we grow many varieties of the same color, the storage ability of it and the look of it and how it can go through storage is the most important, because we store right here in Manitoba, right? So if you think of like the football field, we have multiple like hundreds of football fields of potatoes that are stored in southern Manitoba. And as we take products out and wash it and coming out of the bin, it needs to look the same as it did in September, right? So that's key to ensuring that a consumer has a consistent product.
Well, I would agree you're doing a good job because, again, by my standard, the potatoes are pretty good all year round, which is pretty amazing. One of the things that, in fact, it was just one of the comments that came in, it was just a surprise of how much is actually grown here. We tend to think of the prairies as a grain growing area, and we don't think of produce as well. But I guess under irrigation, Alberta as well as Manitoba has quite a substantial produce industry. One of the questions that came up was, what is the share that the growers get? We know in the food dollar, on average, producers only receive maybe 10 or 15% of the consumer's dollar. The rest of it goes to all the aspects of distribution and so on. Any feel for what that might be like in the case of produce here in Manitoba?
I would say in produce in Manitoba, the growers are getting from what we're selling to retail. And I would say that inflation is all part of retail, because while we're not increasing our prices are increasing at the grocery store. 80% of the dollar goes back to the grower in Manitoba.
Well, good. That's very substantial. I guess, of course, with produce, most of the value added is at the farm, so that would make sense. Some questions have also come in about, pesticide resistance, microplastics. Are there concerns like this in the industry?
There definitely is concerns in the industry. This is, Tracy, our VP of Research, is on the PMRA committee and works closely with CFIA and the group that, approves and disapproves pesticides being used in Manitoba, as well as Canada. What we're seeing in Manitoba, though, is most of you in you grow potatoes in your garden, you know about the potato beetle. And Manitoba has seen the most resistance to pesticides from the potato beetle. The Colorado potato beetle is seen more in Manitoba than anywhere else in North America. And it's the development of pesticides in order to be able to remove that bug, or I don't want to say kill it, but at least reduce the amount of potato beetles in Manitoba, because it's something that's seen here that's not seen in other areas of the country.
I can believe that. And one of the other questions that came up had to do with the cost of compliance. And it was interesting that you mentioned, it isn't just government compliance, it's really supply chain compliance. That probably is costing more than any kind of government regulation that's involved, or is it not? I mean, what's the sort of feel about that?
It costs way more than government compliance. And we're you eat it, right? Like, in order to work with retailers and sell to retailers, it comes as a cost, right? And while you look at companies like, Pepsi and Coke that are paying for space on the shelf, produce essentially does the same thing. We just don't stock our own shelves. But we are paying a huge fee in order to have produce on the shelves in retailers in Canada.
Yeah, that's one of those little secrets that most people don't realize is out there, is that the suppliers are paying the grocers for the shelf space. It's shelf space. To what degree has local production kind of protected us from some of the food inflation? I mean, do you have any sense as to whether prices across the country our potatoes are much higher where they're not grown, or is it just something you wouldn't have tracking?
I would say potatoes across the board are pretty flat. While prices have gone up, it's usually due to demand and supply. It's not about inflation per se. What's going to be happening, this year, is that we have a huge potato volume, huge potato supply in russets. And what we're seeing in the United States is actually that, you can buy a 10-pound bag of russets for $2. So people are actually changing their buying habits and their eating habits, and they're eating russets instead of reds and yellows, which, if you're a potato connoisseur, I would hope that you're not switching to russets, because they're meant for other things besides mashed potatoes. So that's what we're seeing in produce. I mean, your supply is really going to drive your prices. When you see celery going up in the stores because there's frost someplace, or it didn't grow, or we have drought. Same comes to cauliflower, asparagus. A lot of things that are out of season are going to be higher because they're coming in from further away, right? Like, I know there was a mention of carbon tax earlier. Carbon tax has a huge impact on produce pricing because everything travels by truck. So it's impacting your food costs. The further it comes from, the more expensive it's going to be, right?
Yeah, there was a question in the chat about electric or hydrogen powered trucks or whatever. I guess it's still too early in that evolution of trucking to have much impact at this point, but certainly that is going to be part of the future.
I hope so. I know that they're testing an electric truck in Winnipeg right now. The issue becomes how fast it can get someplace without having to recharge, right? So when you're hauling produce, you want it to get, the furthest we go is Calgary before we have to, bring in different produce and move on. We try not to transport produce farther than, I would say 2,000 kilometers. That's pushing it. And you want to get it there as fast as possible and as fresh as possible. So if electric truck is going to take twice as long to get there, it's not going to work for produce, unfortunately.
There's a couple of comments that you made of, storage being a big factor, but also irrigation in order to be more resilient for climate change. I know there's been some talk in Manitoba about more irrigation. Is that something that the growers seem to think is going to be happening, or is it just a desire?
It's what's needed in Manitoba. If we're going to increase our acres of produce acres, we need more irrigation. All of the irrigation that we have today has been built and paid for by the growers themselves. But at this point in time, we're tapped out. So we build our own reservoirs to ensure that we have water for irrigation is the goal is to have it all summer. This summer, we didn't have enough for all summer. Two years ago when we had the huge drought, we only had enough water in our reservoirs until the second week of July. So then, it has an impact on the ability to grow and your yields on your plants, whether it's potatoes or other produce. They need water to grow. And if we don't have enough water in our reservoirs, it's, we can't supplement that if it's not raining enough. And with the amount of climate change that's going on, I think it's supposed to be 6 degrees outside today. It's painful to produce to see that it's 6 degrees outside. We need it to be cold. We need to have lots of snow. And we can't have it be 8 degrees in December, because that's just going to reduce our ability to grow come April and May. The other thing we do is we also tile, right? So, you have a cyclical cycle when it comes to Mother Nature, where you have too much water and then you have not enough water, and maybe 1 year in the 5 you're perfect, which is rare. So all of our land is also tiled. So that tile ensures that the water, when it's super wet, is taken away from those roots as fast as possible to ensure that the roots don't rot or the product doesn't rot when you're looking at something like carrots, right? Or beets or stuff that's going down into the ground. So this is all investment done by our growers as well. There's been no contribution from government for anything regarding, tiling or reservoirs or building irrigation sites or dams or those types of things. It's very different here in Manitoba than it is in Saskatchewan, Alberta, where government is paying for a lot of these things to happen. And here in Manitoba, we're doing it because we have to. We don't have a choice. In order to be successful in our industry, we have to do what we need to do to continue to grow.
We had a very good session about 2 years ago, which is, by the way, available for everyone who wants to see it, on irrigation across the country and some of the aspects of irrigation, the misconceptions and so on that people do have that of what it's a good or bad. I think we've only really time for one more question. It sort of deals with this issues of regulations and subsidies for farmers. Could farmers pull more water out of the air is one question, which I guess, we'd love to do that. But also, the cost of regulations and have they increased? So I'll put that last question to you.
And yes, the cost of regulations has increased, as well as labor, as well as, fuel, fertilizer, all of those things that contribute overall to the cost of the vegetable that's showing up on your retail space aisle and in your cart, right? So, it's impacting us as well as every industry. We'd prefer not to have any more regulations impact us and have the government look at agriculture and produce as a necessity instead of somebody that they can continue to pull money out of. So that way we can continue to feed the world, right? Like that's what we're here for. And that's what Canada does best, whether it's through grain farming or produce farming. We're huge contributors to the grocery store and the plates of people, consumers eating. So the government needs to take a step up and realize that they need to do something to prioritize ag in Canada in order to ensure that it can be sustainable for a long time.
Well, thank you very much, Pamela. It's been a pleasure to have you here, and don't go away. We'll try and get a few questions maybe still at the end. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Thibault Denamiel, who is an associate fellow at the Scholl Chair, International Business at the Center for Strategic International Studies. Thibault's work at the Scholl Chair includes researching the role of immigration policy and innovation, advanced technologies, export controls, transatlantic cooperation on climate and trade policy. His works have been featured in Politico, Inside U.S. Trade, and Reuters. During his time at graduate school, Thibault has worked at the Office of U.S. Trade Representative, the International Trade Administration, and U.S. Chamber of Commerce, among others. Thibault holds an MA in International Relations from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and a BA International Relations with honors from New York University. His title of his talk is Climate Change and U.S. Agricultural Exports, How Future Weather Patterns Will Impact U.S. Competitiveness. And Thibault, I was really pleased to hear your interview on CJOB a couple of days ago. Certainly an interesting area of talk, and one that most of us haven't thought too much about is the longer term impacts. So looking forward to your presentation.
Hi, Barry. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm just going to share my screen. All right, my computer's being a pill, so I opt for a very minimalist style when it comes to slides anyways. So I don't know how much they would have helped, but I'm going to put in my contact information in the chat. So please, if anyone wants to contact me and ask me for any questions, definitely happy to clarify whatever information I bring in here today. And I'll try to fix my screen, but in the meantime I don't want to stall the entire presentation in the conference, so I'll just start speaking about CSIS study and our findings. So Barry has already very kindly introduced me, but I'll just again introduce myself. So my name's Thibault Denamiel, and I have worked in several areas of trade in the United States specifically. So as you mentioned, I worked at the Chamber of Commerce at the International Trade Administration, which facilitates exports from the Department of Commerce in the US, as well as the International Finance Corporation on the multilateral side, and the Office of the US Trade Representative, which is part of the White House. So now I work for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, which is a large bipartisan Washington think tank that specializes in national security. It approaches a broad swath of subjects. We have some regional teams, like our Middle East team. We have some thematic teams, like my international trade team, that do some programmatic work and some research work. And we usually tie it back to national security, but we touch a whole lot of subjects within that umbrella. And my specific team, again, is the Scholl Chair in International Business. Our curse and our blessing is that we do a whole lot of work that can be very varied, although most of our projects are research-based. We look at anything from international minimum taxation at the OECD to financial sanctions and export controls, and also agricultural exports, which is obviously what I'm going to talk about here today. So a few months ago, we started conducting this study, which is the basis for this presentation, looking at how climate change would affect agricultural production on the long term and in turn agricultural exports. The study was focused on the United States because CSIS, again, is national security centered, and we wanted to understand how agricultural exports, which is a historically major source of soft power for the United States, will be affected by the changing climate, but the general findings can be applied to multiple regions. And we did aim to consider a global angle as well. So we don't try to be entirely US centered. So our study takes a few cases. We've looked at the effects of climate change on agricultural productivity for 5 different types of products. We've looked at wheat, soybeans, corn, cotton, and livestock. I'm going to go through each of those. So this was supposed to be my 4th slide on the importance of agriculture. I'll be very brief because I think this audience already knows very well the value of agriculture. Nevertheless, I'd like to give a few factors to illuminate the importance of the study and this conference in general. In the United States in 2021, agriculture and food-related services contributed to almost 6% of US GDP and provided almost 11% of US employment. And worldwide, almost 45% of the population lives in households where agricultural activities represent the primary source of employment. So food systems are essential to sustain economic growth and development. The World Bank has reported, for example, that agriculture is at least twice as effective as other sectors of any economy in raising incomes amongst the poorest segments of the world's population. And obviously, agriculture is essential to feeding a growing population, which is projected to get to almost 10 billion people by 2050. Obviously, agriculture can make global prosperity, but it can also break it. Risk associated with poor diets and food insecurity are the leading cause of death in the world. Shocks to agricultural production and supply chains can drive prices up and provoke famine and poverty for millions of people across the world. For example, between December 2019 and February 2022, the producer price index for grains rose by about 74%, including the impacts of COVID-19 on corn and wheat prices. and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has already been brought up, also caused another shock to grain availability. Before I go into the general productions and the case studies, I wanted to bring some attention to individual severe weather events. So the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has reported how, given that rising average temperatures are associated with widespread changes in weather patterns, extreme weather events like heat waves and large storms are likely to become more intense and more frequent. For example, according to the Carbon Brief, over the past 20 years, 71% of extreme weather events observed by climate scientists were found to be more likely, or more severe at least, by human-caused climate change. And that was particularly pronounced, about 93% of them, for extreme heat weather events. So climate change is therefore set not only to increase general projections of weather patterns, but also the occurrence of severe and sometimes catastrophic weather events, and many of these, such as hurricanes and droughts, are bound to have a deleterious effect on agricultural products. So, for example, again, using a U.S. example that can very much be adapted to other regions of the world, in Southwest Kansas, the plains experienced one of their worst droughts in recent history. Some parts of southern Kansas, as well as northern Oklahoma, experienced their driest March on record. The wheat crops in that area are not only integral to feeding cattle, but also sort of make the region the epicenter of the U.S. bread flour production. So consequently, the price of flour, bread, and other baked goods, but also meat, rose sharply throughout the country and a little bit around the world after the drought. So let me just get into trends in major U.S. agricultural exports. So projections show that warmer temperatures are generally a double-edged sword when it comes to crop productivity. In some places, climate change can lead to more growing degree days when conditions are favorable for crops. However, in all places, climate change will increase killing degree days during which temperatures are too hot for crops to grow. So in other words, while climate change generally spells trouble for agricultural output, different crops will be affected differently. So as a result, crops affected by climate change can be divided into two categories: the one that receive a climate boost if yields are increased compared to what they would have been without climate change, and those that bear a climate burden if yields are decreased compared to what they would be without climate change. So burden on crop yields occur when extreme heat decreases more crop yields. Another major trend, and that one is not to be taken as a rule of thumb, as it's already been pointed out in this conference, or as an absolute rule at the very least. It's just meant as a generalization, but we'll see a general shift northwards. The boosts and burdens that I just mentioned of climate change on agricultural output vary according to location and can lead to obviously regional shifts in production. So due to the northward shift of warmer temperatures, regions that were once unsuitable for arable agriculture could now potentially, not all the time, become suitable, leading to a movement north and higher elevations for a good majority of crops. So projections, again, vary on the extent to which areas will become more climatically suitable for agriculture. However, the common thread is that agricultural production will continue to migrate northwards and upwards, whereas many southern, central, and eastern regions are projected to become more, or rather progressively less suitable due to the increase of killing degree days. For example, some experts predict that the famous U.S. corn belts, due to climate change, which are made up of central and eastern U.S. states, will become unsuitable over time for cultivating corn by the end of the century. All right, now let me go into individual crop case studies. And again, I apologize for the lack of slides, but please reach out to me if you want any more information, or if you want me to repeat anything, you can put in the chat. So the first case study that we had was wheat. So when it comes to the historical effects of climate change on U.S. wheat production, the results depend entirely on the different varieties of plants. So between 1960 and 2018, winter wheat breeding lines declined by 3.6% per 1 degree Celsius warming, whereas the Czech variety, which was the point comparison for the study, declined much more by 5.5% per 1 degree. So despite warmer temperatures, future US yields for wheat are projected to rise in some regions due to anticipated increases in precipitation and carbon fertilization. So in addition to that, climate change will bring about multiple weather changes that will have different and sometimes contradictory effects on output. Coming back to the case of Kansas, for example, projections show that the state's total freeze days will be lower by 17% by 2030 and 23% by 2050. And spring precipitation will tend to increase by 5%. However, by the same year, by 2030, 8% of Kansas counties will experience a drop in winter wheat yields of over 5%, where they would 5% less than they would have been in the absence of climate change. And that's because, again, it's coming back to that idea of boosts and burdens. Despite the benefits to wheat yields brought about by the gradually lowered freeze days and increased precipitation, models also predict that the total amount of spring killing degree days will rise statewide by about 60% due to climate change by 2030 and 96% by 2050. So in other words, the state's wheat exposure to extreme heat will likely have a much larger negative impact on yields and benefits brought about by climate change. So when it comes to exports, they're currently projected to stabilize at around 26 million tons over the next decade. And because other nations will fare better in the global wheat production market, the United States' share of world exports will decrease from about 13.5% in the past few years to 12% by the end of 2030. That being said, only the EU and Ukraine are currently set to exhibit a rising world export share by 2030. Obviously, the latter, Ukraine, depends entirely on geopolitics, but that's what's being projected right now. The European Union's share will increase from about 60% to almost 20%, and Ukraine's share from 6% to 10% throughout the 2020s. It's important to note that 2030 is sort of a key year when you're talking about these climate boosts and burdens and these general projections, because with 2030, obviously not a concrete point in time necessarily, but still a good benchmark to think about. There will be more severe changes to wheat production under greenhouse gas emission scenario outlined by different agencies like the IPCC or NASA. According to that sort of benchmark, wheat yields in African and South Asian countries will decline entirely by 15%, 16% respectively by the middle of the 21st century, which would be obviously quite drastic. Now, soybeans are, the next case study, are particularly vulnerable to the effect of climate change. US soybean yields are projected to decline by up to 25%, a quarter from their normal upward trends by the end of the 21st century. But negative effects, more so than wheat, because it's so vulnerable to the existing aspects of climate change, are already going to be felt in the short run. For example, half of the counties in Minnesota, which is the United States' third largest soybean producing state, will see yields drop by over 5% from what they would have been without climate change, and 17% will experience declines of double that. The state, again, will receive sort of a variety of boosts and burdens. Models predict that total growing degree days will increase statewide by 12% by 2030 and 20% by 2050, but also instances of killing degree days will rise more, and they will rise much more significantly than the boosts. They'll rise by 55% by 2030 and over 100% by 2050. So exports are nevertheless expected to rise in soybeans, at least in the short run, both globally and from the United States. But that's more due to nations' investments to continue to boost yields rather than naturally occurring phenomenons. For example, worldwide production will increase by a fifth in the next decade. So you're not necessarily going to see less of soybeans, but you're going to see increasingly less efficient production of soybeans. So like soybeans, corn is also being threatened by the ongoing already and impending effects on climate change. Sorry. So estimates vary more significantly for corn and for other crops, although they all vary, but the common thread is that it's a fairly bleak picture. For example, the IPCC believes that corn yields will decline by a quarter by the end of the century under a high greenhouse gas emission scenario. Stanford likewise has found that in the next 50 years, we'll have 15% less efficient yields when it comes to corn. So U.S. production will very much suffer, just like the rest of the world. And corn production is already down. It was down almost 10% in 2022 from the previous year. Iowa, which is famously the United States' largest corn producing state, will see corn yields that are lower than they would have been without climate change by 2013 at 5%. More than half of these counties will see yields that are 10% lower than they would have been by 2030. So while U.S. exports again are expected to increase in absolute terms by about 11 million tons in the next decade, share of world exports will decrease from the 33% that the United States currently has to about 30%, given the heightened challenges for the United States corn production. The US will mainly lose out, and this is where the geopolitics of CSIS comes in, because they see this more as a zero sum. The consumer doesn't necessarily see it as a zero sum. They'll mainly lose out to Brazil, which is the only major exporter with a projected increase in market share when it comes to the global corn production. All right, the second to last case study that we have, corn, which is right before livestock, is projected to grow by about 2% annually because it's grown in a warm and humid climate, and the effects of climate change will undermine yields in some area. They'll give boosts in some others. Nevertheless, by 2040, about 40% of corn producing regions will see shorter growing seasons due to the rising heat, and droughts could affect about 50% of global crops by 2030 as well. That's not necessarily seen in the United States as much as it is in other regions. The effects of climate change on corn are expected to be most severe, specifically in two regions of the world, and that would be the corn fields that are alongside the Nile River in northern Sudan, especially, and the corn growing regions in western and southern Asia, as well as southern Iraq and central Iran and southern Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Middle East. So in the United States, some studies have found some already experiencing lower productions, and those lower yields are set to continue still. Our last case study, livestock, is particularly interesting because changes in climate change will obviously affect it directly and indirectly. For example, the impact of climate change on grain crops like wheat and corn will also threaten the feed supplies for grain-fed animals. But in addition, rising temperatures caused by climate change will have direct impacts on these animals, as deviations of even 2 to 3 degrees Celsius cause heat stress and increase vulnerability to diseases and reduce fertility, reduce milk production. And the deviation of between 5 and 7 degrees Celsius results in often in deaths of the animals. So a study conducted in 2021 estimated losses of about 2% in U.S. dairy production, but they also gave room to much more of an increase, about 7%, an equivalent of $2.2 billion a year by the end of the 21st century. But other studies are much more dire. They predict that the dairy and meat industries will lose about $40 billion per year due to heat stress by the end of the century. And obviously the effects of climate change on livestock and animal products will not just be felt by the United States, but by other global producers as well. In some cases, it's already very much happened. Australia is a really good case for that. The Australian dairy industry used to be a major producer the global stage, with about 16% of global dairy trade in the 1990s. But they've continually shrunk, and now they measure only 6% of global dairy trade in about 2020. So the one of the things that the study also aimed to highlight, and that's sort of important in our policy recommendations that are outlined at the end of this presentation, is agriculture's effect on climate change, which is often intertwined with the inverse. Solutions often need to take that into account in order to be most effective. So right now, the agricultural sector generates about 19 to 29% of the world's total greenhouse gases emissions. The current status quo presents sort of a vicious cycle in which agricultural practices contribute significantly to the climate change problem, which in turn render our agricultural practices less and less efficient, meaning that all else equal, increasing amount of carbon and methane emissions will be needed to produce the same output. It also means that as more arable lands become impractical for farming, farmers will have to shrink the globe's remaining forests to have access to viable growing areas. That reduces, obviously, the world's ability to absorb carbon efficiently, at least through green means. And another important facet of the agricultural sector's unsustainable practices lies on waste. That's particularly relevant in the United States. About a third of the world's food produced is currently lost or wasted, and in the US, about 40% of food produced goes to waste, around 120 billion pounds of food each year. And while the US Department of Agriculture estimates that about 30% of food in the US goes uneaten at specifically the retail and the consumer level, food loss also occurs throughout the supply chain, including at the farm level. So I wanted to present some data on price increases, and Michael has already discussed food inflation with much more gravitas than I ever could, but I just wanted to share some of our insight when it comes to the long term. So because of the boosts and burdens issues, crop yields are going to become less and less efficient. It will take an increasingly high amount of land, time, and manpower to maintain and grow the world's agricultural output. However, because countries are pouring money into this problem or are set to pour money into this problem, for example, via the US Farm Bill, we're not necessarily going to see a global decrease in output right away, just again, a decrease in efficiency. So you might see the same products in grocery stores, but there will have been much more money and effort put into putting these products there than there might have been before. And that is, of course, provided that businesses and governments effectively migrate crop production to adapt to the changing climate conditions. So are we going to see an increase in prices? Most likely. Estimates vary enormously based on the multiplicity of factors I've already touched on. For example, European Central Bank researchers have concluded that climate change has already pushed up food prices and inflation overall, and continued global warming is set to increase food prices between 0.6% to 3.2% by 2060. 2021 study by NASA is more negative about the problem. In just over a decade, inflation is projected to increase by about 3 percentage points in a best case scenario for climate change. In a high emission scenario, that inflation impact could be as high as 3.5 percentage points by 2035 and 7 percentage points by 2060, which is obviously significant. So if we consider the short term for Canada, I know all of you know about the Canada Food Price Report, so I will not be repeating it, but the findings of the study can also be sort of replicated there with a few changes in the factors. The last thing I want to discuss, and then I'll turn it over for some questions, is the policy proposals that we had to tackle the issue. Our policy proposals were specifically tailored to the US Farm Bill, which is a 5-year-long spending authorization bill that comes back to the Green New Deal, the New Deal, rather. almost a century ago at this point, that is reiterated or should be reiterated at the end of each of its authorizations. So every 5 year, a US Congress passes a new farm bill. That being said, again, the findings can be sort of replicated in other nations' spending bills on agriculture. So aside from insurance, climate-related components are scarce in the Farm Bill's current projections. So we wanted to put more of an emphasis on those. So the first thing that our researchers came up with was first launching a Farm Bill program to assess what regions of the United States are going to see their agricultural production capabilities expand or shrink due to changes in climate. Even under moderate emission scenarios, the cultivation geographies of all the crops I just mentioned are going to shift north in some capacity. And more severe emissions are going to even exacerbate these changes. Given that the US has the means and territory to shift production of major crops in the short term, it should consider how to efficiently phase into that transition throughout the 21st century. The second proposal that we had was to identify ways of incentivizing sustainable agricultural practices that are more climate friendly and climate resilient. The former would be, for example, expanding investment in climate smart agriculture. And the second would be to incentivize ways in mitigating food waste, which is prevalent everywhere. It's particularly prevalent, again, in the United States. Farm level food waste specifically can be mitigated through several avenues. For example, investments in R&D can drive innovation to pest management solutions. Surplus channels that sell below grade crops. What's rated as below grade crops would help redistribute products that don't get sold on the market. And surplus in some crops could be used to produce biodiesel. One of the last two policy proposals that we had was relevant to a program called SNAP, which is a US food assistance program that's relevant to the Farm Bill specifically. Again, it exists in a lot of countries around the world. And that would be to leverage that food assistance program to incentivize alternatives to carbon intensive goods. So SNAP, that program in the United States, helps feed about 47 million people every year in the United States alone. So the program could be adjusted to gear incentives towards less carbon intensive goods that contribute to climate change, such as beef. Alternatives to these goods could be available as a discount through the program, through the SNAP assisted shoppers, as a way to encourage our consumption and reduce purchases of more carbon intensive counterparts. And the last policy proposal that we had is more of a mitigating one. It's one that, again, already exists in the Farm Bill, but definitely deserves some attention nevertheless. And that would be to enhance crop insurance coverage. With the rise of killing degree days and severe weather events, such as hurricanes and droughts, the share of crops that will fail is just set to increase. As a result, more farmers will require expanded insurance coverage for their crops to remain financially viable over time. In addition, these crop coverage, insurance coverage programs are sometimes inaccessible to smaller farmers. They're concentrated in large part to top producers, so it would help to expand it to the smaller farmers as well. That being said, insurance without guardrails may provide incentives to continue farming on fragile lands, especially as climate change is said to have an outside effect on production. So crop insurance coverage should come with clauses stipulating that beneficiaries of those programs should aim to phase out unsustainable farming practices that can lead to, for example, soil erosion and higher carbon footprints. So that's what we had. We're definitely takers of ideas all the time, especially as the Congress keeps on debating our current farm bill. So that is the extent of my presentation. Again, thanks for bearing with me. Apologies that my laptop didn't work with me. I'm just glad I was actually able to speak with you guys.
Well, thank you very much, Thibault. That was great. In fact, one of the things that stands out to me is we've just come through the COP28, and I don't remember any reporting talking about, the issues of food production in the future, or where we're sitting like that. Why hasn't this topic become more mainstream, do you think?
That's an interesting question. I think it's because, well, COP28 was, for one, focused on more high-level diplomatic achievements, which one could argue that and you could obviously include that in the agriculture. You could include agricultural production in that. But I think it was seen as one of the niche details that they weren't able to actually get to this time. I also think this problem just hasn't received as much attention when it comes to policy making as it should. And again, I'm talking from a US lens specifically here. But I think that can be applied to a variety of countries. Again, in that farm bill, the effects of climate change on food production are almost non-existent right now. It's sort of evident that it's just not on policymakers' radar, and a whole lot of the people who are debating at COP28 sort of come from a similar crowd. And so I think that may just be an issue of actually bringing it to the forefront of their attention.
It's interesting you mentioned these killing degree days and what that means. My understanding is a lot of our crops are much closer to that limit than most people think. Rice being one that is particularly vulnerable. I do recall speaking with one of my friends a few years ago, and he's in Wichita. And I said, "Oh, and how's your garden going?" They said, "I got no tomatoes." I said, "What do you mean? You got the heat, you got the season. How can you not have tomatoes?" He said, "Well, he found out that the temperatures have to get low enough at night for the flowers to set. And by the time we got to that point, there wasn't enough season to grow tomatoes." So, just these ideas of climate and temperatures are something that we haven't really thought, at least I haven't thought very much about, and maybe most people have. So, what does it really mean to get high temperatures? We know it's hard on people and hard on animals, but we don't think about the fields and crops quite the same way. One of the things that you mentioned was 2030, seeing a 5% drop in yields in Kansas. That sounds to me pretty substantial. That's not very far away. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, you did hear that right. And I mean, not only is 2030 looking a little bit dire, the following years, 2050, usually present even more dire consequences right now, especially under high greenhouse gas emission scenarios. And that depends a little bit based on who you ask, IPCC or NASA or EPA. With IPCC actually usually being slightly more positive in their scenarios than other researchers, which tells you something. But yeah, it's quite significant, right? And what that tells you, depending again on how businesses adapt and how governments adapt, how much money they pour into this issue, that these yields are going to be less and less efficient, and there's just that much more capital that's going to be needed to keep on feeding your population and keep on exporting your food, right? And obviously Kansas is not the only example in that. I think it's not even necessarily the most dire example. When we talked about Iowa and corn, for example, those yields, I think for a majority of counties by 2030, we're going to decrease by 10% or more, which is obviously incredibly significant as well. So that varies across the crops. Some of them are going to fare better than others, but that's something that general theme is going to stay true consistently throughout. And coming back to your comment about killing degree days and growing degree days, and how we're going to reach that threshold fairly quickly. Yes, and I think sometimes people who want to be more optimistic than maybe they ought to be sort of look at the growing degree days and see, see, we're going to see an increase in some capacity on the days that are going to receive warmer temperatures. Yeah, but killing degree days are set to increase much more significantly more quickly, and that influence is going to be outsized compared to the growing degree days.
Well, your point about things moving north sounds good for Canada, and there is certainly a very large area in northern Ontario called the Clay Belt, equal to the agricultural crop production of Manitoba. Actually, 1.5 times Manitoba's crop area could come into production, but most of that land doesn't have the same kind of soils or buildup that you'd have in terms of your yields. And I'd like to point out to people that it's a little tough plowing granite, which is what we got a lot of the north. So the opportunity to compensate for moving north just doesn't seem like it's reasonable.
Yeah, I agree, and that's why I'm fairly hesitant in bringing up that northward migration, because it's not at all an absolute rule at all. And I think that the Canada's example brings to mind another example that was very much at the heart of the national security debate, and still is actually, and that would be Russia, right? Whether it would actually benefit in some manner from climate change, and people were, in the national security circles, one would say worried. That's not necessarily always the right words, because crops being grown is always a good news for the world in general. Nevertheless, it was a question, right? It was quickly concluded that climate change wouldn't work out for Russia's agricultural sector nearly as much as one might think, because they just don't have the soil for it, the majority of their territory. And that's probably something that's going to be replicated throughout northern regions of the world as well. So that compensating through that northern migration is an incredibly optimistic lens through which to see the problem, especially since sometimes it's going to be about a trade-off, right? You may be able to grow some things on that northern land that you're not going to be able to grow when those other products migrate. And then where do the former go? That's going to be more difficult to establish.
Of course, we're also quite concerned that other things move north too, pests and so on. So it's not just necessarily climate. But one of the questions that came in asked whether farmers in the U.S. receive any credits for sequestering carbon. Is that kind of activity there for trying to encourage climate change to be diminished?
Yes, that's not necessarily included in the farm bill. Well, that's not included in the farm bill. And again, that's supposed to be reauthorized this year. So maybe there will be more climate change considerations. Maybe we'll have changed something about the policy discussion. Who knows? But other large subsidy packages have taken a more climate considering approach to them. The biggest one obviously being the Inflation Reduction Act. And the Inflation Reduction Act is mostly about looking at the energy transition, right? It's not necessarily about agriculture at all. It's more about critical minerals to build EV batteries and reshoring EV battery production to the United States and things like that. And it's a whole issue in the trade world in general, obviously. But a much smaller part of the Inflation Reduction Act also includes sequestration. And they're still defining exactly how to give out these credits, especially since there isn't much of a cap on them. That being said, it's starting to become part of the conversation. It's again a very minimal part of the Inflation Reduction Act. The IRA is this enormous package, almost $400 billion, potentially more, but depending on how much people take advantage of the tax credits. And I think the sequestration is about 30 million of that, so a much smaller part. That being said, it's becoming a part of the solution, and maybe we'll see more of it in the future.
Most of us, I suppose, our immediate personal concern is what's the price of food going to be and so on. But I've also been hearing talk about mass migration the fact that you mentioned in Africa, crop yields dropping, that we're going to have a lot of people on the move just because they simply cannot live where they are now. Again, the time frame for that is always a question mark. 2100 is still quite a ways out. But even by 2030, 2040, it seems like there's going to be an increase. We're already seeing a lot of pressure for people to come into Europe or other places. Did you get into any of that aspect in your study of what's the impact on population moves?
We didn't necessarily look at that in our study. I'll speak to it a little bit nevertheless because I have opinions. But I mean, obviously, it's going to be a large logistics problem, and I would argue that 2100 isn't necessarily that far away, especially since when it comes to populations in islands where the water levels are going to rise, that's not necessarily related to agricultural production, but it is related to people's movements. I think that kind of large mass migration is going to come much more quickly than the turn of the century. And it's going to be a management issue, obviously. That being said, and that's not necessarily the most politically salient thing to say in the United States, although people are starting to see that there's a problem. We are seeing a lot of labor shortages in this country, and I think in other developed countries as well, especially as they're undertaking these large industrial policies, these large state-led investments. You're seeing a whole lot of lack of workers to actually implement these subsidy packages. For example, with the United States large infrastructure investments in 2021 of about 1.2 trillion, you're going to see a shortage of construction workers of about 300,000 every year. And I think well-managed increased immigration can actually help these countries that are going to face significant labor shortages deal with those. And obviously it comes with a feeding issue, it comes with allocating the jobs efficiently issue, but I think if it's done well, it can be part of a solution.
Well, certainly everything's connected to everything. And even are those construction jobs going to be there if we don't have money to pay for it? Because when you talk about a 5% decline in wheat yields, we generally look at that as being maybe a doubling in terms of price change. So a 5% decline in supply is maybe a 10% increase in price, and that's going to feed all the way through. So maybe our current fascination with food inflation today will look pretty minimal in the future if we start seeing crop yields changing dramatically as they could. I don't have any more questions in the chat except one about the question of again pests and disease and fungi and so on impacting agriculture and how that might be more in the future. But I think we've more or less have covered that a bit. In any case, we are at the end of our session. Thibault, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And Pam, if you're there still, thank you very much. I know Mike had to leave as his battery was dying, so he didn't. Sorry, Pam, we didn't get you back in the action again. But your comments about irrigation, I think if we're going to look at climate change, how do we create most security? To me, that's the best bang for the buck in terms of security, is to make sure we have water for our crops, because without that, we're not going to survive. In any case, I'd thank you very much, folks. I'll pull this to an end, and I'd like to introduce